Okay, we're back with the faithful ones again. And nice lunch, we enjoyed that. Okay, we're not switched on our wheel, that's good. Okay, we're going to have a look this afternoon at the Battle of the Four Beasts, which is in Daniel chapter 8. And an interesting chapter that parallels the material that we have dealt with so far. But let's just again remind ourselves as we review the previous vision of Daniel 7 we've looked at this morning and last week, and the four beasts that came out of the sea. In the sequence of events, you remember we ran through these. We have the four winds representing war and strife beating up upon the peoples of the Mediterranean area. And the four great kingdoms that came out of the sea were represented by the lion with eagle's wings for Babylon, and the bear with the three tusks in its mouth for Medo-Persia, the leopard with the four heads and the four wings of a fowl representing the Greek Empire, and then that was followed by the nondescript beast that was rather terrifying, that had 10 horns, and remember, iron teeth. And out of those 10 horns, 3 of them were removed. They were plucked up by the roots to make room for a little horn that we focused on in our study this morning. And then the prophecy goes on to tell, after the activities of the little horn, then the judgment takes place in heaven. And the nondescript beast ends up being put to the flames along with the little horn, and Christ receives his kingdom. That's the outline, the sequence of the vision of Daniel. So a very important sequence that we need to remember, not just for this afternoon, but in the successive studies that come on in the remainder of the book of Daniel. And it's also important to note the time of the visions of Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8. I'll show you why in just a few moments, but first of all, the vision of Daniel chapter 7 was actually given, the Bible says, during the first year of King Shazar of Babylon. Now, do you remember who Belshazzar was? His father was King Nabonidus. He was the successor of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nabonidus, he came to the throne in 555 BC. That's a confirmed date. We have a lot of cuneiform tablets from Babylonia, some in the British Museum and some of the other museums around the world. And these tablets help to not just not just to endorse the historical records in the book of Daniel and the Old Testament, but also to shed light. And some of these, like this one, it tells us that Nabonidus came to the throne in 555 BC. Now, Nabonidus, he was more interested in arts, in explorations and in archaeology and in the sort of pleasantries of a relaxed kind of life. He wasn't really interested in ruling an empire. And so he appointed his son Belshazzar to become his co-ruler. Thus Belshazzar became the second ruler of the kingdom. And that's why when the writing on the wall appeared and Belshazzar said, you know, anyone who can interpret this, I'll make the third ruler of the kingdom. He couldn't make him the second because he was the second himself, and so he offered to make him the third ruler. Now, Belshazzar came to the throne in 553 BC. Now, note that date, because we're told in Daniel 7, in the first year of King Belshazzar, Daniel had this vision. So that vision would have been given during the first year of his reign, which was 553, and we can say it might have overlapped into what we call 552. In that period when the vision was given. Now, chapter 8, the vision of chapter 8 was also given during the reign of Belshazzar of Babylon, but it came in the third year of his reign. So the vision of chapter 8 would have been in 550 BC. And it's important to note those things. That's 12 years after this vision was given, Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians. Now, it's interesting that God foretells the empires that would follow Babylon. he actually mentions by name in Daniel 8 the next two successive empires. So 12 years before, God foretold what would happen, and it came to pass, which helps to confirm the accuracy and the reliability of the scriptures, but it also reveals to us how God knows the future. All right? Now, something else to remember, then it's important to recognize that Daniel received the prophetic vision of chapter 8 when the Babylonian Empire was still in existence. So now let's come to the 8th chapter and look at the vision. And Daniel describes, first of all, in the first half of this chapter, what he saw, and to his custom, as he did in chapter 7, in the second half he then explains what it means as the angel instructed him as to its meaning. And so in chapter 1 and verse 2, Daniel says, in the vision, I was looking and I saw myself in Susa, the capital, in the province of Elam, and I was by the river Ulai. So Daniel was at Susa, or sometimes referred to as Shushan, in the metropolis of Elam, and Shushan or Susa was the capital of that particular province. Okay? And he was by the river Ulai in vision. The river Ulai is also known as Eleucus, which was actually not a river but a canal that connected two rivers, the Corprates and the Coaspes. They were joined together by this canal, obviously to help with the with shipping and transportation and so on. So Daniel in vision was in Susa, looking at standing there by the river Ulai, and he says, I looked up and I saw a ram standing beside the river. It had two horns, and both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. So you got the picture? A ram, two horns, but one horn is longer than the other. Okay? Just bear that in mind as well. And so he says, I saw the ram, it was charging westward, and it was charging westward and northward and southward. It wasn't charging eastward, notice it was charging westward, northward and southward. All beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became strong. And as for the ram, the angel now explains, he says, as for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. So now we're seeing a different animal to what Daniel was shown in chapter 7. What was the animal that was disclosed in chapter 7 representing Media and Persia? Anybody remember? See how well you were listening now. A bear, well done, yes, a bear. And that bear was standing in a certain way. How was it standing? Lean on one side, it was raised up on one side, suggesting that one power was stronger than the other, and that of course is represented here by one horn being longer than the other. The Medes were there with the Persians, but the Persian Empire was getting stronger and bigger, and eventually it became just known as the Persian Empire. So represented here then, God says, and when did he say this? 12 years before Babylon actually fell to the Medes and Persians. God actually foretold 12 years before. Now that shouldn't surprise us, because if you remember one of our earlier presentations, we showed how God through the prophet Isaiah had foretold some 200 years before that Babylon would fall really to the Persians, but he actually mentions the king that was ruling at the time to Cyrus. Mentioned it by name 200 years before Cyrus was born. Isn't that amazing? God is a God who knows the future. Doesn't this give you confidence in what God says? It does, doesn't it? So 12 years before Babylon fell, God told Daniel in this vision that Medo-Persia was coming on the scene, and he depicted it by the use of a ram, which is now different to the wild beast that we saw in chapter 7. There's a reason for that, and next week I will give you that reason. I'm going to tell you today, I'll keep you wondering, alright? But next week I'll tell you the reason why God changes the animals in chapter 8 from chapter 7. Very important reason, and we'll come to that. Just bear this in mind, that we're now into the second half of Daniel, which is the prophetic section of Daniel. We've dealt with history, and in the history we've seen the typologies that will reflect the spiritual realities that were to come in the future. Some of those realities are now in the past as far as we're concerned today, but some of them are still in the future. So we see here God using different animals, but there's a reason for it, a very important reason, and we'll discover that in our presentation next week when we have a look in more detail beyond this prophecy here. So under Cyrus the Great, Persia became the strongest of the two kingdoms, and that's why one horn was higher than the other. And it's interesting that they crowned their kings in Persia with a ram's head of gold that was studded with precious stones. And their coins actually carried a ram's image. Excuse me. So God knew what he was doing by using these symbols. Now I have here a coin on the screen. It's not a Persian one. I don't have a Persian one. But it's a photograph of a coin, and it goes on to Greece, which was the next kingdom. But it shows can you see the ram's horns here? This is Alexander the Great on the coin. There's a ram's horns. And this was to show that he, his kingship in connection with Ammon, the sun god of Egypt, Ammon-Ra. But it's an interesting factor, and obviously the Greek culture picked up things from the previous cultures. They're just an interesting side interest there. But Daniel said, I saw the ram with the two horns charging westward and northward and southward. And all the beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became strong. The ram was charging westward and northward and southward. Why do you think it says that? Because the ram came from the east. So it's not going to be charging eastward. It's coming from the east, and it's coming towards the west, and it conquers towards the west, it conquers towards the north, and it conquers towards the south. And you can see this map here on the screen that gives the outline of the territory that Persia conquered. This territory here, so we say coming around here, that's where the king of Babylon conquered. That was Babylonia. Now Persia is even stronger, and it conquered westward because it took in Babylon, which is the empire of Babylon. There's Babylon, and the Mesopotamia that we read of in the Bible, that's the land where Abraham came from, Mesopotamia. The Chaldees was down here in the southern part, but between the two rivers, that's what Mesopotamia means. Potamos is the Greek word for river, and it's Mesopotamia is between the two rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris. So Cyrus, he took Babylon, Mesopotamia, and he went across into Syria in this area here. And then of course he came northward, which is conquering up towards the Caspian Sea up here, and in what we know as Armenia, this territory coming around up here. And then of course we got southward, where he came down through Palestine, took that, and he took Egypt and Libya, and then further south into Ethiopia. And thus you can see here on the map the territory of ancient Persia. So it was a larger kingdom. And the prophet went on to say that he saw this beast charging westward, southward and northward, and he said all the beasts, in other words, all these other kingdoms that he conquered, and the kingdoms were just listed there, they were powerless to withstand it. And no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became strong. Now the overwhelming power then of the leader Persian was so strong that no one could stop it advancing. And it continued to do so as far as God allowed it to do so. Because remember, God is in control. And then Daniel saw another beast. He says, as I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes, and it came toward the ram with the two horns that I had seen standing beside the river, and it ran at it with savage force. So it's quite a dramatic scene here. And as Daniel is looking here, he saw this approaching the ram, and it was engaged against it and struck the ram, breaking its two horns, and the ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground and trampled upon it, and there was no one, it says, who could rescue the ram from its power. So the ram was not as strong as the goat that succeeded it. So the angel explained to Daniel that male goat is the king of Greece. That's the kingdom of Greece. And the great horn between its eyes is the first king. All right? So 12 years before Babylon fell, God foretold not only by name Medo-Persia would succeed it, but he said when Medo-Persia falls, it will be followed by the Greek Empire. And the first king is represented by that horn, that notable horn that is between its eyes. Have you got the picture? Now, the symbol of the goat is also interesting. Now, let's say next week I'll explain the significance of changing the animals. All right, we had wild animals in the historical section. In the prophetic section, we've got different kinds of animals. The symbol of the goat. An ancient tradition claims that Keremus, the first king of Macedon, he followed a herd of wild goats to Edessa, where he established his capital. And he called it Ager, the goat city, from where the national symbol of the goat for the Greeks emerged. And the first king that we know of the empire was Alexander. Now, Alexander, he was the son of Philip of Macedon. Philip of Macedon was a successor later on after the king we just mentioned. And when he died, his son Alexander became the next ruler of Macedon. Now, Macedon is just a territory today which is only part of Greece as we know it today. But Alexander became the founder of the Greek Empire because he's represented here by this horn, this notable horn on the goat's head, this goat that represents the empire that is now emerging. And he's the one who became known in history as Alexander the Great because of his conquests. A very interesting story. But he goes on, as I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. That suggests speed and agility, doesn't it? Wait a bit, we'll come to it. The goat had a horn between its eyes, and it came and attacked this other goat. But as I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west. Now, why from the west? Because Macedon was in the western part of the empire. Persia came from the east, Greece came from the west. And you can say Babylon was somewhere in the middle, all right? Palestine, Babylon was somewhere in the middle. So this ghost, it appeared from the west. So both Babylon and Medo-Persia, which came from the east, they were not as strong as Greeks. The Greek Empire emerged from the west. And the speed, without, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, almost though it's flying. Flying is the fastest mode of travel. You know that, don't you? There's less resistance when you're in the air. That's why jets can fly even better at high altitudes of 36,000 feet or more. So it suggests here the speed and the aggression by which the founder of the Greek Empire would fulfill his mission. And that is true because history records exactly that situation. And in the previous illustration, in chapter 7 of the Greek Empire, represented by the leopard, is a very fast animal. It's not the fastest. I think the cheetah's the fastest, isn't it? But the leopard has 4 heads. We'll come back to those in a bit. And the 4 wings of a fowl, which suggest speed, extra speed. So Alexander the Great, he came conquering from the west, from Macedonia. He came into Asia Minor, and he took Syria in northern Palestine, and Phoenicia, Cyprus, Egypt, Babylonia, Persia, and he went on into the very mountains of North India. And in fact, he took his troops as far east as he possibly could. He would have gone further had they not refused to go. They went as far as the Indus River. Now, the Indus River is one of the longest rivers in Asia. It's about 1900 miles plus something in length, which flows from Tibet into Jammu and Kashmir and the rest of Pakistan. And Alexander, he extended his empire that vast distance, and he would have gone further, but his troops, they said, look, we've gone far enough, we've been away from home for all this time, we're not going any further. And so they forced him to return, because without his troops he couldn't have advanced much further. And you know, talking about speed and the distance, I'm sorry it's chopped off the bottom of the screen. The projector wants lifting a little bit here, but I'll tell you what it says. In less than 10 years, Alexander had marched his troops over more than 10,000 miles and conquered the ancient world, forming the greatest empire ever known up to that time. And so you can imagine now the wording of this prophecy, he became exceedingly great, and he was a strong king, and he came flying through, conquered his empire. Now Macedonia is this territory over here. There's Greece, and this is part of Macedonia. Coming to Turkey here, Asia Minor, and then coming down to Palestine. He took all this Egypt, over Babylonia, and Persia, he took that in, and then he came right up here to the borders of North India and Pakistan. He would have gone further, as we said, had his troops not refused to go. So a massive empire that he took at that time. So Alexander the Great, he met his comeuppance now, because his troops said, we're going to go back. And so they went back as far as the city of Babylon. Now Babylon had not been destroyed as a city at this time. It was one of Alexander's generals, Seleucus, who later destroyed the city of Babylon. And he took a lot of the materials to build his new city called Seleucia. I think I've mentioned that to you before. But Alexander went back to the city of Babylon, which was now in his empire, and he intended to make this his headquarters. But you know, it wasn't long, just a short while, I think a matter of days or weeks, when he contracted a swamp fever, possibly malaria, caused by the mosquitoes. And he was also an alcoholic, so aggravated by his heavy drinking, he died of a fever in just a few days. In fact, it's said of Alexander that he conquered the world, but he refused, or he was unable to conquer himself. You know, when a person's under the influence of alcohol, it's the alcohol that controls them. And unless they really want to give it up, they can't. You can dry them out, you can force them, but they go back to it. And Alexander, he was addicted to this, and he got this malaria, or whatever the fever was, and at the age of 33, he died. He conquered the world, but he couldn't conquer himself. It's rather a sad story, isn't it, when you think about it. But what goes on now? You notice the leopard had how many heads? 4 heads, okay? Bear that in mind now, because those represent the aspects of his empire, because the prophecy goes on in chapter 8, it says that the male goat grew exceedingly great. So the big empire that we just reviewed there became exceedingly great. And by the way, it was through Alexander that the Greek language became the lingua franca. It became the main language, thus paved the way for the writing of the New Testament in one language, in Koine Greek. Okay? So he did contribute something towards God's cause, even though he may not have done it intentionally. But the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, 33 years old, at the height of his power, he conquered the biggest empire ever known. At the height of his power, the great horn was broken. Who did that horn represent? The first king, Alexander. So he was broken, he died. And it says, in its place came up 4 prominent horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. 4 prominent horns towards the 4 winds of heaven, north, east, south and west. So this is spreading out now, leading further to different parts of the empire. But the kingdom was divided now into 4 different kingdoms. So the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of his power, the great horn was broken. You know, when he was dying, there was a question, who's going to succeed you, Alexander? Who have you appointed to be your successor? That's what Perdiccas, his faithful friend, asked him. To whom have you bequeathed the kingdom? And Alexander replied, to the strongest. Well, when he died, his kingdom went into disarray because his kingdom began to break up. It became 4 horns replaced the big horn that was representing Alexander. That horn was broken and 4 horns came up in its place, it says there. And the angel explained to Daniel, he says, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation. But notice this, but not with his power. Not with his power. These kingdoms did not convey the same power as the empire. The empire was broken, it became weak, and these 4 kingdoms took place. How did that happen? Well, after his death, as we said, his empire entered into disarray. There was turmoil, there was war, there was strife, the army was scattered, the towns and cities were being plundered. It was in a terrible mess. Things just went from bad to worse. And finally, 4 of his generals divided the empire between themselves. And so we find that Lysimachus, he took the north, including Cappadocia, that's what we call Turkey today, and Thrace, same area, and northern Asia Minor. And then we find that Ptolemy, he took the south, Egypt and Palestine, and Cassander, he took Macedonia, Thessaly and Greece, and Seleucus, who we mentioned a few moments ago, he took the east, including Babylonia, Persia and Syria. And Seleucus was the one, as I said, who actually reduced ancient Babylon to rubble, still a heap of rubble today. God said it would remain so, and it is, even though Saddam Hussein, when I was out there, Saddam Hussein was trying to rebuild the city of Babylon. Just as Nebuchadnezzar stamped on the bricks, built in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Saddam Hussein was having put on the bricks, built in the reign of Saddam Hussein. But unfortunately, it never succeeded because God said it never would. God is in control. I keep saying that because this is the message that God is giving us here as well. So these 4 generals, they divided the kingdom between them, represented by the 4 heads of the leopard, and in this chapter by the 4 horns that came up in place of the other horn that represented Alexander. So you can see here the division of that kingdom. Lysimachus, he took this northern section here, which went across into Turkey, which was Cappadocia and Thrace, and the northern part of Asia Minor. And then we've got Ptolemy, who came down into Egypt down here. Cassander, he had Macedonia, and Seleucus, he took the remaining part to the east there that we've seen. Now, It goes on here. Let's come back to that passage. We'll read this again. At the height of its power, that's the horn representing Alexander, at the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. I've explained that. And out of one of them, out of one of these 4 horns, came a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. So there came up 4 prominent horns from the 4 winds, north, east, south, and west. And out of one of those horns came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. What do you think the beautiful land refers to? If you were the prophet Daniel, call the beautiful land. Home. Where was home? Palestine, Israel. Or Judea it would be, wouldn't it there? Yeah, you know, when I was out in the Balkans doing evangelism, I used to sometimes have a little bit of fun, and you know me, I've got a sense of humour, and at least I think I have. I would have a translator as I was speaking to the public, and I keep referring to the English language as the language of heaven. And of course they enjoyed this, but one day the ministers in the team, they caught me out. They came to me privately and said, Brat Michael, he used to call me Brat, which took some getting used to, but I discovered in Slovenian it meant brother. Alright? So, Brat Michael, we've finally decided that when we all get to heaven, we're all going to speak English. So I said, oh, why is that? They said, because the English can't learn any other language. And I had to really laugh. I thought, well done, well done. But you know, there's a truth in that, really, isn't there? And I see the folk from Portugal. You're agreeing, yes, of course. You know we're not very good at that. But however, how did I get to this now? I've forgotten how I got to it. The beautiful land, thank you, Richard, yes, the beautiful land. I mean, I would refer to Britain as the beautiful land, wouldn't I? But Daniel refers to his country, the beautiful land. So these 4 horns, they would reach out north, east, south and west, and that would include the land where God's people at that time, the Jews, were. Now there's a focus on that land in a particular sense in the Bible, because the Bible story, the story of redemption gathers around God's people wherever they're moving. From Eden, from Ur the Chaldees, into Palestine as we call it today, and so on. And to Babylon when they were there, back to Judea. But then in the New Testament it focuses on the new promised land, God's kingdom, doesn't it? So you see the picture that God is flowing here, the beautiful land, because that's the main focus. Okay? So this extended north, east, south and west, including toward the beautiful land. So, looking at the great platform of prophecy, Daniel 2, the image of head of gold, arms, chest of silver, thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet part of iron and clay, representing in that order the parallel of the beasts of Daniel 7 that we saw, the lion with eagle's wings, and the head of gold representing Babylon. That was succeeded by Persia, represented here by the lopsided bear and the arms and chest of silver, and now a new beast has come on the scene, the ram with the 2 horns. And then we find that the thighs of brass, they parallel with the 4-headed leopard, with the 4 wings of a fowl, and beside that is the goat with the 1 horn between its eyes, and then when that's broken, it's divided, or 4 horns come up, it's divided between its 4 generals. That's parallel with the 4 heads of the beast there of Daniel 7. You can see the parallels. And then Rome with this nondescript beast that we have been looking at, parallel with the legs of iron, and the beast had iron teeth, and then the 10 horns representing the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire. And so we find that that parallel flows through. So when these 4 horns emerged after the fall of Alexander the Great, the kingdom, in other words, of his empire was broken up into 4 main sections. It wasn't as strong and as great as before, the prophecy said. But then the next empire on the scene was to be Rome. It says out of one of those 4 it would emerge. Now your common sense tells you if those kingdoms are scattered around, Rome is coming from further west. It's going to be, as it moves on, it's going to be moving in that direction. I did read something in my preparation, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was explaining that the way it's written in the Hebrew language, because Daniel 8 is now in the Hebrew language. It was in Aramaic. We'll come to chapter 8, it turns to Hebrew language. So I'll say more about that next week. That the way it was written, it does not necessarily translate came out of one of those 4 horns, but it's coming out of that area where those horns point to, if you can follow me. So Macedonia will be pointing in that western direction, which is logic when you think about it, because Rome came from that direction, be next to it, wouldn't it? So we have the picture there. Anyway, let's move on here, because it says in Rome, out of those 10 horns, there came up amongst them, after they were there, came up amongst them another little horn, uprooting 3 other horns, which we studied this morning to identify as the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, and the Heruli. And this little horn had the eyes of a man and mouth speaking great things. We explained all that this morning. However, it comes on here now, a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the north, towards the south, the east, and towards the beautiful land. All right, he says, as for the horn that was broken, that's Alexander the Great, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not in his power. Okay, we've stated that. Then he says, at the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. And so we see now the emergence of this little horn coming up out of one of them, as it said there in the text. And without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. Now who is the prince of princes? Who?
Jesus is the priest of the priests.
Who's the king of kings?
Jesus.
Jesus. So he is the prince of princes. In fact, Daniel talks about him as the prince when we come further on in the book. So this little horn power is going to destroy many and even rise up against Jesus, the prince of princes. Do you begin to see something here? Because now as we move on in Daniel, in chapter 8, we begin to see this conflict of the gods, of Satan, and the great conflict between Satan and Christ. That conflict began in Eden. In fact, it began before Eden, it began in heaven, the Bible says, didn't it? He was cast out. And from Eden, the story of redemption goes all the way from Eden when man fell. Because there in the Garden of Eden, when man sinned, Christ came to search for them. And that's where we have the first inkling of the gospel. When Jesus came and he said, Adam, where are you? They'd been used to Jesus meeting them in the evening every day. At the cool of the day, he came amongst them. But now he's coming, where are you? As if he didn't know where they were. And whereas before they might be playing a game of hide and seek and having fun, I'm sure they did. Now they were hiding. He was coming because he said, the day you eat that fruit, you will die. Was he coming to kill them? They were afraid. They were hiding. Was he coming to kill them? Is this what was going through their mind? But when he found them, he didn't kill them. He came to give them the promise of redemption. As Jesus said later when he came to this earth, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which is lost. And there in the Garden of Eden, we have the first inkling of the gospel, where we see Jesus coming to seek and to save the lost. Beautiful picture. That's the story. The Prince of Princes. And so here we see in this great conflict between Christ and Satan, the things now begin to develop. And as we move on in this prophecy, and next week we're going to deal more in this area, and as we move right on to the end of Daniel, we shall see this. So, without warning, he, this little horn, shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the Prince of Princes. So is exceedingly great. And this then has to be a power, this little horn has to be a power that is greater than its predecessors, greater than Greece, greater, that's the Greek Empire, greater than the Persian Empire, greater than the Babylonian Empire. Friends, there is only one power that fulfills this prophecy, just as it did in the succession of the four empires in Daniel chapters 2 and chapter 7, and that is the Empire of Rome. Because we know that the Roman Empire followed in the wake of the ruins of the Greek Empire. It was at the Battle of Pydna. There was no battle where Rome came and overthrew the empire like the previous empires had been overthrown by their successors. The empire had broken into four sections, and it was in a very weak situation. So as Rome marched on and began to just gather its territory, like a harvester machine just gathering up the bales who were moving on. And historians really locate the beginning of the Roman Empire at 168 BC at the Battle of Pydna. And it's interesting to look down here. Egypt became a province of Rome in 30 BC, but it was later, as Rome gathered up even more power in 168 at the Battle of Pydna. By the way, you've heard of Cleopatra, all right? They've got her in a mummy now in the museum, mummified form. She was the Queen of Egypt. And there was Mark Antony, and he got killed. And when he died, and she heard that he died, the story is that she poisoned herself. She actually allowed an asp, a very poisonous snake, to bite her. She couldn't face the onslaught of Rome without him. And Rome came in, it was about that time, about 163, 164 BC, when Cleopatra committed suicide. And so Egypt later became a province of Rome in 30 BC. Rome conquered Syria in 65 BC. It's going back a little bit before Egypt. But Palestine came under the Roman Empire in the year 63 BC. And as you know, when Jesus came to this world, it was a Roman Empire that was ruling. In fact, Joseph, his father, his stepfather, he had to go down to Bethlehem, the city of David, to register because the Roman Caesar, he had decreed that there should be a census taken, taxes had to be paid. So Caesar Augustus called that. He was under the Roman Empire, and of course it was under the Roman Empire that Jesus was crucified. But in AD 66, this is now after Christ, the armies of Rome again marched upon Jerusalem in response to a rebellion. Have you heard of Masada? Who's heard of Masada? A few of you have heard of Masada. Masada is a rocky fortress that overlooks the Dead Sea. And Herod built a palace on the top of this fortress. And during the wars of the Jews, the Zealots held out against them. as one of the last strongholds. They finally fell. But it was in the War of the Jews that Rome came upon Jerusalem, and it was in AD 66, as I say, and for 4 years this war lasted between the Romans and the Jews. And Jesus had given a warning to his followers. You remember, he said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, do you remember that? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then get out, flee. He was talking about the destruction of the temple coming. The disciples asked him this question. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then get out. Well, Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. They came, and no one could get out. They were under siege. Anyone who tried to escape would be caught and no doubt killed. And they remembered the words of Jesus. How could they get out? And then there was some trouble up in Galilee. And the armies were withdrawn to go and attend to this insurrection up in the north. And the followers of Jesus, they escaped. They got out. They remembered his words. And Josephus tells us that not one Christian perished. It pays to take heed to the warning of Jesus. But the other Jews who didn't accept Christ said, the army, it's all over, that's it. And they continued their war against the Romans. Then they returned. And it was in AD 70 that Titus marched on Jerusalem, and he took the city, he destroyed the city, he destroyed its temple. In fact, he gave orders that they were not to destroy the temple. But that temple caught fire. We don't know what happened. Maybe one of the soldiers, with a fire torch in his hand, went to peer inside this mysterious temple of this God of the Jews, and maybe caught the curtains on fire or something. The cedar inside went up. And they say that the gold in that temple, mixed in with the mortar, ran down the river, down the steps like a river. It was a sight. The temple was destroyed, and as Jesus said, there was not one stone left upon another. And so, dear friends, the words of Jesus came true. The armies of Rome took Jerusalem, destroyed it in AD 70. And the people who tried to escape were crucified around the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And there were so many, they were crowded there. Josephus talked about them being crucified back to back on a cross. And you go to the Garden of Gethsemane today and you see the old gnarled olive trees. And you sort of look at them in a caressing way and you think, Jesus knelt amongst these trees. He may have knelt amongst the olive trees when he was there, but not those trees, because those trees would have been used to make the crosses, to crucify these people. They were new trees that were planted that you see there today. But the ones that did survive, they were marched in chains back to Rome. And they were made to build the Colosseum. And I read that it took 8 years to build that Colosseum. They must have been worked to death. And if they didn't die in building it, they would have died in the arena. Many Jewish survivors taken to Rome as prisoners. And thus the dispersion of the Jews took place throughout the empire of Rome. The empire of Rome is referred to as the kingdom of iron. In Daniel 2, in chapter 7, you've got the iron teeth. And Rome has waged bitter persecution of both the Jewish people and later on of the Christian church, initiated by them ordering the crucifixion of Jesus. And the empire eventually, as you know, broke up into 10 kingdoms. Mention those 10 kingdoms. And then, of course, 3 of those kingdoms were destroyed to make way for the little horn that came to the forefront. And thus the persecution by the church, by the religious organization that was now ruling the empire, broke upon the faithful of Christ, as we read this morning. Unlike pagan Rome, this power was not just a political power, as the prophecy said, as we saw this morning, was different to the others. It also became a religious power as well, namely the apostate church, as portrayed there in the chapters of Daniel 7, and as we shall see here in chapter 8. And so the symbols of Daniel 8, let's notice the two-horned ram, reminding ourselves represented which empire? Medo-Persia. The male goat that followed represented the Greek Empire. And there was a notable horn between the eyes of that goat, representing its first king, who was Alexander the Great. Then the four horns of the goat representing the four divisions of that empire when Alexander died at the height of his power. But they didn't have the same power and strength and control as the empire had had. First of all, out of the place of Alexander arose another horn, out of one of these four horns, which began with pagan Rome. But then pagan Rome emerged also as a religious, political Rome. So the little horn at first, though pagan Rome, eventually became exceedingly great. And it rose up against the Prince of Princes, papal Rome, rising up against Christ, the Antichrist, instead of Christ, taking his place, usurping his position, claiming to have the power to change what he had said and what he had done. And so we see the counterclaim about the little horn. You see, some people think and teach, and a lot of writings you read today will say the little horn was not the papacy, it was actually Antiochus Epiphanes. But I can't agree for that, for a number of reasons. First of all, as I said this morning, we have those 10 evidences, those 10 criteria, if you like, in chapter 7, that the little horn has to comply with. It's only the papes that fills those points. Antiochus Epiphanes may fulfill some of them. I mean, he did offer pigs on the altar in Jerusalem as a defiance. He did offer some persecution towards the Jewish people. But there's a number of other things in there that he just doesn't line up with. But there's some other reasons here too I want to share with you. You see, why was Antiochus Epiphanes suggested instead of the little horn? I'll tell you why. For the same reason why the method of interpreting prophecy also was given a different method. In our first presentation I said there were three methods. There's the historical method, there's the preterist method, and there is the futurist method. The futurist method says that everything in the books of Daniel and Revelation are to be fulfilled way off in the future, perhaps during the last 7 years. That's where all this idea of the secret rapture and that eventually emerges from, all these different theories people have. That's the futurist method. The other method, the preterist said it all happened in the past, so forget about it, it's no longer relevant. But the historicist method is the method that we've been following. You can see the historical flow, can't you? It's the method that God used in the Bible. We can see it in the prophet Daniel. We can see it in the prophets, a number of the prophets. It's the method that Jesus used, the New Testament church used. It's the method that the Protestant reformers recognized too. The Protestant Reformation had to be met by a counter-reformation that was started by the Jesuits. I told you this morning, and I showed you in their church how they were trying to suppress the Protestant movement by crushing the head of Martin Luther in their sculpture work and tearing out the pages of his writings and Calvin's writings and Zwingli's writings and so on, trying to destroy the influence and the power of the Reformation movement. And so they had to do something different to divert attention away from the truth, for obvious reasons. And this is why the idea of Antiochus Epiphanes was introduced. to divert attention from the little horn being the papacy in fulfillment of the prophecy there. Antiochus Epiphanes, does he actually meet the criteria? Well, I've answered that already, but let's just have a look here at three other things. First of all, as we have noted, the little horn in Daniel 8, it said became even greater than Cyrus, that's Persian ruler, or Alexander the Great. Well, did Antiochus Epiphanes become greater than those two men? Hardly. In fact, none of his line came anywhere near as great. And he himself was anything but great. I'll tell you, Antiochus Epiphanes, he was always having to pay tribute to Rome. So who was the greatest, him or Rome? The kings don't pay tribute to themselves, they pay it to those above them. He was always having to pay tribute to Rome, and he in fact died in an effort to try and raise the extra money that was needed to pay more tribute. So he certainly wasn't any greater than those before him. And his subjects even called him Antiochus Epimanes, meaning the madman. So it doesn't sound as if he was looked upon as great. He was just one of many other kings at that time. Secondly, the little horn, according to this prophecy, became exceedingly great toward the south, which is the Egyptian kingdom, toward the east, which was the Seleucid kingdom, and towards the pleasant land, which you've identified as Palestine, and even, it said, against the Prince of Princes. Well, the kingdom ruled by Antiochus was actually Syria. So it was already in the east. And so it obviously couldn't refer to him. And secondly, the latter there, even against the Prince of Princes, was something that Antiochus could never do, since he died in 164 BC, long before Jesus was born. The third point is something we noted this morning. According to Daniel 7:25, the little horn would reign supreme for how long? 1,260 years. You remember that? Now Antiochus obviously didn't manage to reign that long. Let me share with you, he only reigned for 11 years, from 175 to 164 BC. He was born in 215 BC, and therefore that means he only lived for 51 years. So there's no way that he could reign supreme for 1,260 years. No one man has reigned, apart from God, has reigned for that length of time. But the papal power has. It started in 538 BC, when the decree of Justinian went into effect, following the removal of those three opponents that stood in his way, and it continued reigning until 1798, 1260 years later, when General Berthier, Napoleon's general, marched on the Vatican, took the Pope prisoner to Avignon, and brought an end to the Holy Roman Empire. So Antiochus Epiphanes does not fit the bill. It was to take one's attention away from the papacy, but the idea was suggested. The only power that meets all the criteria then is papal Rome as defined below. The two-horned ram, representing Medo-Persia, was followed by the male goat, the Greek Empire. The notable horn, Alexander the Great, he became exceedingly great, and when he died, the four horns of the he-goat represented the four divisions of the empire when his generals took control. And the little horn that emerged from one of them was pagan Rome, which eventually became papal Rome, because papal Rome became exceedingly great and rose up against the Prince of Princes. And the question is, how did he do that? Well, note this before we close. In the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 that we are now looking at, we are introduced to an extremely important vision. As I said this morning, dear friends, it's imperative that you attend each of these series, because if you miss the links. What we say next time will not tie in. We need to connect the links to form the chain. Okay? And therefore we have very important vision here of a ram that help the sequence of history reinforces the interpretation of a ram followed by the male goat, and then a little horn power that would seek to destroy the truths of salvation. A power that would claim to exercise the prerogatives of Christ. Very important vision. And that, dear friends, is going to be seen in our next presentation, entitled The Defiling of the Sanctuary. So I would suggest to you, when you go home today, before you come next Sabbath morning, read Daniel chapter 8 once again. Okay? And you might want to read on to the end of the book. It won't take you long. You've only got another 4 or 5 chapters, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 chapters, up to 12. That's all you need to read. Just read it again, so your mind is focused on what we're saying and what we're coming to. Because we're now moving into the most important part of the book of Daniel. We have dealt with the historical section that portrays the typologies. We're now moving into the prophetic section that portrays what God is revealing to us for these last days. The book of Daniel is a book for the time of the end. Daniel was told to seal that book up until the time of the end. When we come to the book of Revelation, that's built on the prophecies of Daniel. And in order to understand the prophecies of Revelation, we have to understand the prophecies of Daniel. When we come to the prophecies of Revelation, the book is unsealed. And that book is for us. And we insult God when we refuse to listen to what his word has to say to us. So let's make sure we give God the time and the opportunity, because he is speaking to us in these last days. He wants us to be ready to meet the trials that are before us. And he wants us to know what's happening. He may not give us all the details of how it will transpire, but he's told us what's going to happen so that we need not be taken by surprise, unprepared. We can be ready. He's told us what is sufficient for us to know for this time. So let me encourage you, friends, encourage those who are not here this afternoon to stay, to come, for their own sake, not for mine, but for their sake, so that they can gain something from this book, because we're moving into the most important section of the book of Daniel. Okay? This chapter is really the climactic chapter in the book of Daniel. For the defiling of the sanctuary that this little horn is engaged in doing. What does it mean? What relevance has that to you and to me? Christ is in control. And we see that in the next prophecy. Okay? So we're going to come to it in due course. So may God help us. Brother, we're going to sing the hymn and then have a prayer. We'll just have a prayer now. Okay, let's just bow our heads and seek God in prayer. Loving Father in heaven, we do want to thank you for your wonderful love to us. We thank you for the evidences that are abundant to give us that assurance of the accuracy and the testimony of your word. Lord, you are speaking to us because we need to hear you. Help us to realize how important it is to hearken to your voice as you speak to us through your word. You have given us these prophecies to study, to understand. We don't just need to know the outline, but we need to dig into them to unearth the riches of truth that are there to be found. And Jesus has promised that if we seek, we shall find. Help us therefore through your Holy Spirit, through a willing mind, to have an understanding heart, and to be able to gather together the great gems of truth that will be of value to us as we prepare for the time ahead, the time just before us, to strengthen and prepare us to stand in the great trial that will come at the end of time, and to stand before the Son of Man when he appears in all his glory. For the great day of his wrath is soon to come. As the Bible says, who shall be able to stand? Only those who are clothed in his righteousness, who have that living and meaningful relationship with him, are the ones, we are told. And so help us, Lord, not to neglect the most important thing while we're busy doing so many other things. Help us to make our priority the priority of a relationship with Jesus. So bless us now as we journey to our various places. Be with us till we meet again. We ask in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen. Thank you.